This video discusses, and thus spoils, many plot points from the video game Spec Ops the Line. It shows various gory and disturbing scenes from the game, as well as referencing similar events from real military conflicts. There comes a time in every video game essayist's life when they have to talk about Spec Ops the Line. It is simply one of those games, a game that is so clearly doing a thing that it exerts an almost inexorable pull over anyone who talks about games as a medium. Since the game came out in June of 2012, we've seen dozens of video essays, piles of academic journal articles, and at least one full-length book analyzing the thing the game is doing. Most games do not get this level of critical attention. Most games have not been talked about as much as Spec Ops the Line. Because of this, I've heard many of the same things said about the game for 12 years now, that it interrogates the player's notions of choice and agency within video games, that it criticizes the narratives and typical structures of military shooters, that the protagonist might not be reliable or even alive, and that it maybe even has something to say about American interventionism. And yet, with the countless words written, narrated, podcasted about this game, there are still things that I've never heard anyone talk about. Somehow, Spec Ops the Line still has more to discuss. Why its specific choice of war crime? What exactly is the CIA doing in this game? How is there so little work on the haunted death screens? Twice in the entire game, something different happens if you die. In 2 scenes, if your character is shot dead, the game doesn't load in the recognizable way, doesn't show you a static image and a line of text, but instead does something different, something moving and singing. And then it's gone, and not only is it gone faster than you can consciously clock, if you die again, even in the exact same place, the game seems to forget that it ever did something unusual. The second time, the third time, the 10th time you die, you'll just get the normal loading screen. Steam tells me the first time I played this game was July of 2013. I remember the exact moment I was thrown into this not death screen, the way I froze and the hair stood up on my arms, and a decade plus later, I'm still thinking about it. And this is not what people talk about when they talk about Spec Ops the Line. So, for the uninitiated, for anyone unlucky enough to not own the game before it was delisted from digital shelves in January of 2024, here's the general pitch of Spec Ops. An elite Delta Force team of Captain Walker, Lieutenant Adams, and Sergeant Lugo are sent into Dubai in the wake of a giant sandstorm that crippled the city's infrastructure. Delta Force aren't the first Americans sent into Dubai. Both an Army battalion and a CIA Black Ops team are already active in the city, but no one has made it back out. Delta Force's objective is simply to see if there are any survivors, then back out and radio for extraction and additional help. However, Delta Force almost immediately run into resistance, first from armed local insurgents, and then from the US Army Battalion themselves.
Return fire! They're soldiers! They will kill us if we don't! Now open fire!
Delta Force is drawn further and further into the city, along the way shooting hundreds of apparently rogue members of the US military, inadvertently slaughtering dozens of civilians, and ultimately destroying the city's entire water supply. In response to these events, Captain Walker, who we play as for the entire game, becomes more angry, aggressive, and impulsive. In the game's finale, we learn that Walker in fact fully hallucinated many of the conversations of the previous days, making him even more responsible for the atrocities that befell the city. Along the way, the game skewers many common tropes of military shooting games. Mounted turret sections, AC-130-style aerial bombardments, and prototypically badass service members are all subverted by the events of the plot. It's a story where the player is regularly compelled into doing overtly evil acts, because the game tells you that this is the only choice you have. And this is understandably what most of the conversation about the game centers on. I recommend the Errant Signal video on the game if you're interested in learning more about this line of analysis, or a couple recent episodes of my podcast, Something Rotten, or hell, read Brendan Keogh's book, Killing is Harmless. One of the frequently cited strengths of the game is how it initially appears as a bog-standard cover shooter, allowing it to more effectively upend player expectations. This subversion happens through the literal plot, like the fact that you're fighting the US military, but also through more traditionally gamey elements. Most notably, the tips in the loading screen throughout the game gradually morph from the expected information about guns and gameplay mechanics to surreal and accusatory messages. There is no difference between what is right and what is necessary. Do you feel like a hero yet? To kill for yourself is murder. To kill for your government is heroic. To kill for entertainment is harmless. Over time, these loading screens become an expected part of the game. Much as you grow accustomed to Walker's increasingly unhinged combat barks or the moment of slow-mo that accompanies a headshot, you begin to expect that each game over will be paired with an accusation. The US military does not condone the killing of unarmed combatants, but this isn't real. So why should you care? In the last couple levels of the game, the combat steps up its difficulty dramatically, meaning that you'll be seeing these loading screens even more frequently. And because of this frequency, the impact of their surreality lessens a bit. Until, that is, it happens. In the last act of the game, your squad mate, Lugo, is killed by the enraged civilian population, his death another crack in the already fractured psyche of Walker, and then a few minutes later, in the middle of combat, a heavy kicks down the door of a bunker. But it's not a generic heavy enemy, it impossibly is Lugo, and his voice, supernaturally warped, screams, "You left me to die," and then, if you're me, he kills you. The power of his gun working in tandem with the shock of seeing him again, and instead of the level art and some smirking loading message, the game just cuts to this. It's a blasted white screen, but moving, warping, and distorting. With a modern SSD, it disappears almost too quickly to clock its imagery. But it's obvious what it is. There's only one thing it could be. I struggle to articulate what I find so alarming about this apparition. Much of it is simply that the game is breaking its own rules, breaking them in something as seemingly immutable as a loading screen. Moreover, when you play the section again, Lugo is gone, replaced by a generic enemy who tells you nothing. But unsettling on a deeper level is the idea of who, exactly, the loading screen is for. Who it's talking to. In the gameplay, you are Walker in the same way that the player controls any video game protagonist. In the loading screens, you are you, the game addressing you not as a military captain, but as a person holding a controller. But then, for this one-time serene nightmare hallucination, who are you, exactly? Who is this targeted at? When you come out of it, Walker shakes his head like he's seen it too. So is this rebuilding the fourth wall? Rejecting that separation between player and character? Much of the commentary that Spec Ops is doing is overt, unmissable. One of the game's weaknesses might be its need to underline that commentary again and again, making sure by the end that you will get what it's doing. I think that's why this nightmare has stuck with me for so long. The fact that it is so missable, that it defies easy categorization. I didn't experience the other time on a normal playthrough. The other haunted death screen is just after a helicopter crash, when it seems that your other squad mate might also be dying. Its imagery is dark, where the other is blinding. But both are, of course, about the white phosphorus. The defining moment of Spec Ops the Line happens in its 8th level, The Gate. In the previous level, Walker and his squad stumble into the devastating aftermath of a white phosphorus shelling. The air itself seems to catch fire, and pieces of burning phosphorus stick like glue to anyone in the vicinity. Walker, Adams, and Lugo are all horrified. And yet, in The Gate, the squad comes across a military checkpoint, and Walker decides that they only have one way through the camp, by using a conveniently located white phosphorus mortar to wipe out the nearby troops. You launch a targeting camera to hover above the battlefield, and then bombard the checkpoint with phosphorus shells, the explosions flattened through the black and white overhead perspective. You burn soldiers as they run for cover, roast tanks and ATVs, and then accidentally, but inevitably, send a shell rocketing into a bunker that turns out to be full of civilian refugees.
Armor disabled.
There is no discussion of Spec Ops that doesn't cover the white phosphorus. It is the moment where the game's critique of other military shooters is drawn into sharpest relief, the sequence that challenges player agency, the turning point for the characters, etc., etc. And I don't mean to discount any of that writing, much of which is very good, but I've been surprised in all the papers I've read and videos I've watched how little discussion of the specific method I've seen. That is, why not bullets, grenades, or missiles? Why not tanks, or drones, or AC-130s? Why white phosphorus? Why that weapon specifically? The most time I've seen spent on this question comes from a really excellent paper called Race, Gender, and Genre in Spec Ops the Line by Soraya Murray. She writes, Lugo reacts to the horror, claiming they've gone too far this time. Who, exactly, has gone too far? The question may point to Walker, Adams, and Lugo on one level, to the game designers who painfully invoke the use of this weapon in Iraq by both Saddam Hussein and the United States, and to the US military itself, which has defended its use of white phosphorus by arguing it is not in violation of chemical warfare prohibitions, since it is officially classified as merely incendiary. Similarly, in another paper called War Bites, the critique of militainment in Spec Ops the Line, Matthew Payne writes that white phosphorus is an incendiary weapon that has been used by US troops in Vietnam and Fallujah, Iraq, in so-called shake-and-bake operations against insurgents. Both papers recognize that the use of white phosphorus is a charged decision, intentionally evocative of the US applications of it in combat, but neither spends more than a few sentences on the topic. When I first played the game, I assumed the shelling was specifically evocative of Vietnam, a war partially defined by napalm and the imagery of its aftermath, a war synonymous with ideas of military failure and broken men. These themes are all very present in Spec Ops the Line. The game as a whole is also very much indebted to Apocalypse Now, obviously a defining piece of art about America in Vietnam. But white phosphorus itself, although technically present in Vietnam, has been culturally defined by its use in the 21st century. The years leading up to Spec Ops' release give a far more relevance to the game's use of white phosphorus imagery than a simple nod to Vietnam. For instance, in 2004 in Fallujah, Iraq, a number of sources accused the US military of violating international law through its use of chemical weapons, notably including white phosphorus. But the US Department of State responded that it had not violated international law, in part because it was not using white phosphorus as a chemical weapon. Quote, "Phosphorus shells are not outlawed. US forces have used them very sparingly in Fallujah for illumination purposes. They were fired into the air to illuminate enemy positions at night, not at enemy fighters." This statement was retracted months later, after US military officers published a review of the Battle of Fallujah in Field Artillery magazine, in which they said that white phosphorus proved to be an effective and versatile munition. We used it for screening missions at 2 breaches and later in the fight as a potent psychological weapon against the insurgents. We fired shake and bake missions at the insurgents, using white phosphorus to flush them out and high explosive munitions to take them out. Having been caught in a bald-faced lie, the military then pivoted to a bizarre discourse on what exactly qualifies as a chemical weapon, and what exactly would constitute a war crime. Some within the military, like Lieutenant Colonel Venable, disputed that the use of white phosphorus on enemy combatants violated the Chemical Weapons Convention because, as Murray referenced earlier, it is an incendiary, not a chemical.
White phosphorus is a conventional munition. It's not a chemical weapon. They are not outlawed or illegal. It is an incendiary weapon and may be used against enemy combatants.
Others, like reporter George Monbiot, said that it was an obvious violation because it is a weapon with chemically toxic properties that was leveraged against human beings.
They were firing these munitions directly at the combatants in Fallujah in order to exert the toxic effects of those munitions upon those combatants, to flush them out so they could then be killed. In doing so, the US Army was acting in direct contravention of the Chemical Weapons Convention. It committed a war crime.
But no one, after the military's retraction at least, denied the effects of the phosphorus. No one denied its efficacy at flushing people out of buildings, nor disputed its deadliness when pictures emerged of civilian bodies draped in their own melted skin. What white phosphorus did was largely agreed upon. The military just argued that those photographed outcomes were incidental to the weapon's primary strategic usage. The State Department originally claimed that the white phosphorus used in Fallujah was for illumination, to see enemy fighters at night. But ironically, the far more common usage of white phosphorus is for the exact opposite purpose. It is one of the very best chemical options for creating a smoke screen. White phosphorus is incredibly effective at forming an impenetrable wall of smoke, one so dense it can't be seen through by the naked eye, night vision, or laser targeting. And maybe, the military hopes, these same obscuring properties will apply to our scrutinization of their tactics. No, they say, we weren't using this substance to turn people into glue. We were simply using it to create a cover so thick no one could see what we were doing. This is the same justification given by Israel when accused of using white phosphorus to shell schools, markets, and hospitals in Gaza in January of 2009.
شاهد النار في الصف يا جماعة. انزل 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 وراك انزل.
When confronted with extensive evidence of white phosphorus airbursts in heavily populated areas, the IDF stuck to their traditional playbook. The Israeli military first vehemently denied any usage of white phosphorus, then, when presented with overwhelming documentation of its lie, amended its statement to admit that yes, it did use white phosphorus, but only in accordance with international law, and then, finally, the IDF said that it would conduct an internal investigation to determine if its use of white phosphorus was, in fact, in accordance with international law. The best kind of investigation, of course. Internal. What emerged over the course of these denials, half-admissions, and rationalizations was the same rhetoric we saw with the US military 4 years prior. The IDF claimed that they were using white phosphorus for smokescreens. Human rights organizations claimed that the IDF's reckless deployment of white phosphorus over densely populated areas caused numerous agonizing preventable civilian deaths. These statements don't necessarily factually contradict each other. Their conflict instead grows from whether you give more weight to stated intent or observed result, the reasoning of a commander behind an artillery cannon, or the ashes of a civilian under a sky set ablaze. And this is very specifically what the white phosphorus scene in Spec Ops is about. Not just player agency, not just poking at the tail of other military shooters, but an interrogation of the spectacular failure of intent as a rationalization for harm. The protagonist of Spec Ops constantly just makes decisions he's confident in for no other reason than he believes himself a good person, and thus all of his decisions are what a good person would decide to do. He does not stop to consider what his self-perception as a good person has meant for the lives of others. In fact, faced with the reality of the inferno in that bunker, Walker decides something else, that he couldn't be at fault. His actions instead were forced by the overt villainy of his antagonist, that even though he literally pulled the trigger, the responsibility for those civilian deaths actually lies with whoever decided to put all those refugees right there.
You're not even... I'm gonna make these bastards pay for what they've done. Now, are you with me or not?
The white phosphorus emboldens Walker. It is so extreme, so obviously horrific, that it motivates his continued march into hell, necessitates him finding someone else to blame. He will burn the city down before he accepts responsibility for his crimes. The thing about white phosphorus is that it doesn't just burn. A campfire can burn, a stove can burn, but the phosphorus sticks, seeps into the skin. Doctors report injuries growing day over day, the chemical continuing to combust inside the body. It is also simply poisonous. Burns covering relatively little surface area on a person's body can cause sudden organ failure. White phosphorus first destroys someone from the outside in. Then, it destroys them from the inside out. Later on in Spec Ops, hours past the phosphorus attack, you meet a CIA agent named Riggs. At Riggs' encouragement, you destroy the remaining water in Dubai, an on-its-face catastrophic decision that Walker agrees to almost immediately. Taking on this mission is an obvious further step in Walker's deepening delusion, further contradicting his stated quest to rescue the people of Dubai. This point is what most analysis I've read has focused on. But Riggs, the CIA agent, also has reasoning, somehow even more bleak than what we've already heard from the game. The reason he's destroying the water, the reason the CIA is there in the first place, is because of the US military's breathtaking inability to help Dubai. All the force in the world couldn't aid people trying to escape the city. Rather than admit that, rather than reveal the depths of their atrocities, Riggs and the CIA just decide to bury the whole thing. A city deprived of water and smothered by sand, another smokescreen. A veil of death so thick, the truth will never escape. There comes a time in every video game essayist's life when they have to write about Spec Ops the Line. And the temptation, of course, is to make it about us. That's what the game is leaning towards, right? With its cheeky loading screens and fourth wall breaking dialogue and dissection of the other military shooters we've played. It is undeniably a fascinating game to approach from that angle. So much of both the game's focus and our focus when talking about it is on what feels bad to do in the game. It's hard to play, it's intentionally unpleasant. It is all about me and what I'm feeling and how I'm reacting. But making it about us actually blunts much of its political messaging. War crimes are not just the set dressing for having a conversation with the player in Spec Ops, not meant to be understood as merely a commentary on choice or whatever. The scene in which people are needlessly killed in horrifying ways is actually about people being needlessly killed in horrifying ways. After a decade of white phosphorus being deployed and then lied about, described as merely an obscurant while burning its way through hair and flesh and lungs, the weapon makes its way into a game about killing civilians. That is a very fucking intentional choice. Maybe that's why I remember those nightmare-haunted death screens years and years after first playing it. Not just because they're unexpected, not because they're different, but because they somehow go beyond all the player-focused, clever stuff. Break through all the fourth wall winking and stop talking to Walker and the gamers for a moment. It finally isn't about you. It's about them. It should have always been about them. One of the questions that kept occurring to me while replaying Spec Ops the Line is why it is so singular. Why are there virtually no other games of this scale and production attempting the same level of critique? It's possible contemporaries, other games with a potentially bold take on modern combat, never seem to make it to release. We never got to see where Rainbow Six Patriots would have landed, for example, or the infamous 6 Days in Fallujah, which was cancelled in 2009 amidst a storm of controversy. Except, 6 Days in Fallujah actually did release. It's in early access on Steam right now, and I don't know a single thing about this modern permutation of a legendarily controversial title. So I played it, and I made a whole separate video about it, a video you can only see on Nebula. American veterans of the Iraq War, parents whose kids had enlisted and then died, various other military leaders, they were all vocally against the release of the game. 6 Days in Fallujah, to us, was functionally a survival horror game.
They were really trying to hide their cool shit. What am I gonna tell George Bush, man? We just didn't find anything.
This joins my extensive collection of Nebula exclusive videos on things like Arkham Knight's remarkable graphics, the failed space weapons of the US military, or almost an hour on that terrible Pauly Shore Pinocchio movie.
But you know, what about my dream?
You have a dream?
Which was one of...
Nebula is an increasingly important part of my work, both because I have so many additional videos there, and because the support of Nebula viewers allows me to take on thornier, less advertiser-friendly topics, like the essay you just watched on war crimes. Nebula is also something you can get for a remarkably reasonable price, just $3 a month, if you sign up with my link, nebula.tv/Jacob Geller. That's a 40% discount off the normal price. Once you've watched that, you could check out any of the other delights on Nebula. Philosophy Tube has a whole new short film on there, Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend, or literally as I was writing this, I went to Nebula and saw that the new Sarah Z video just went live, days before it was available on YouTube. Every day on Nebula is a surprise in what kind of perk you're gonna receive. And by signing up and watching things there, you ensure that all of us get to keep doing this in an otherwise incredibly unstable media environment. So that's it. Whether you want to hear about 6 Days in Fallujah, get early and exclusive access to tons of good folks, or just support me as I make more ill-advised videos, Nebula is the way to do it. Sign up today for 40% off an annual subscription at nebula.tv/Jacob Geller.